To celebrate the launch of Salt Publishing's new anthology, Best of British Fantasy 2013, edited by Steve Haynes, Sci-Fi London gathered 3 of the contributing authors for a roundtable discussion about fantasy writing in general, if there is such a thing as British fantasy writing, and if there is, what it might be. Joining me around the table were Jon Wallace, who wrote Lips and Teeth for this collection and whose debut novel Barricade is published next year by Gollancz, E.J. Swift, or Emma to her friends, who contributed The Complex and whose acclaimed first novel Osiris, first part of the trilogy The Osiris Project, is published by Del Rey, with Book 2 Catavero due out later this year. And finally, Lavie Tidhar, whose novel Osama won multiple awards last year and whose short story The Last Osama can be found in this anthology. It's hard to keep track of all the stuff that Lavie has going on, but keep your eyes peeled for new novel The Violent Century, published by Hodder, and 5-part comic series Adler from Titan. Just a quick heads up that we had both sound and picture issues during the talk, so it ends a little bit abruptly, but nevertheless there's a good hour of solid discussion, so enjoy.
It appears to me from reading this that this new anthology, Best of British Fantasy 2013, is that what constitutes fantasy seems to have broadened quite a bit, quite significantly over the last few years, and kind of anything goes as far as the genre is concerned, because in there's science fiction, there's fantasy, there's horror, there's what I would determine those kind of things, kind of lumped together as fantasy. Would you agree that it's a much broader church than most people kind of give it credit for? I'll start with you.
I think it might just depend on the way the editor defines what they're looking for, because I've had a similar thing. I edit a series of anthologies of international speculative fiction, which is called the Apex Book Award, SF. And for me, SF just stands for speculative fiction. It can be anything really. So we've got a bit of horror and a bit of fantasy and science fiction, but people just tend to read that as the book of science fiction and get very annoyed that it's got fantasy and horror in it. So I've got a feeling that's part of it. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah, no, this is where I'm dying a bit, but
I mean, because fantasy, most people when they think of fantasy, and I'll throw this over, most people when they think that fantasy, say to Emma, they think of swords and sorcery, and it's quite often it falls in 2 stools. There's either kind of the chicks who dig vampires books, or there's the guys with big swords who are saving the world kind of thing. And it doesn't seem to be much in the middle, although we all know that there is, but that's kind of how fantasy is generally kind of pictured. This, obviously, as well as showing that obviously there's much more to it than that, but I wonder if when people picking this up are going to expect to read ghost stories, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think I get the same thing with saying to people that I write science fiction, and I think it just comes back to how somebody perceives that particular label. If I say to people I write science fiction, they immediately think I write about space, which I don't. I mean, I have written stories set in space, but that's not how I define my work. And I think when I started reading a lot more science fiction and fantasy, I was quite surprised myself to sort of realise quite how broad those genres are, and you can have everything from slipstream stuff to dystopian stuff to alternate history, and that all kind of comes under that very broad label. So I think it depends on what a person kind of thinks of when they first think of that label, and you may have 2 people talking about fantasy who have completely different ideas about what that means to them.
But you didn't actually think you were writing science fiction?
No, I didn't sit down and think I'm going to write a science fiction book. I just sort of realised about, I don't know, I guess about halfway through when people started saying, "Oh, you're writing science fiction," and I was like, "Yeah, I guess I am."
So what did you think the book was then?
I don't think I thought of it in terms of labels at all. I just had an idea. I had a very visual idea for what I wanted to write, and I wrote it, and I worried later about where it was going to fit in. I mean, that may not be the best way to go about writing, but it's the only way I can really write, I think.
Jon, what do you think about the having kind of seen the book, and the stuff that's in there is obviously quite different? How do you think people are going to find it in terms of being labelled fantasy, and then what they find within?
Yeah, I haven't read the whole thing yet, I must admit. But I mean, I think it's always true that when you've got a label like fantasy or science fiction, there's a huge amount that comes under that. I think someone's always going to have a beef with exactly what makes up fantasy and what makes up science fiction. Like Lavie was saying, I mean, when I wrote my book, I actually started off, the first thing I ever wrote was trying to write like a big, the great British novel kind of a thing. I thought this isn't working, and I actually picked I'm going to pick a genre and go with that, and I picked science fiction and very definitely tried to write a science fiction book. So that sounds completely different to how you've come about.
Reverse process.
Yeah.
But isn't the danger in doing something like that you're okay, I need to write science fiction, so it needs to have certain tropes, certain elements in it that define it as such, as opposed to just sitting down and writing and let the chips fall where they may, and if it turns out you've written science fiction, so be it.
It would be a problem if it may be. I mean, I don't think it would be really, because I know that people like Stephen King say, I think it's fine to read lots of what you're writing. But I mean, I actually, when I sat down to write science fiction, I'd seen a lot of films and watched a lot of science fiction telly, but I hadn't actually read a huge amount of science fiction. Most of the science fiction I'd read was sort of Ian M. Banks, really, and that was about it. Actually, it was about the only one I read. But when I started writing it, I read a lot more now. So I don't think that was a problem. But I think someone like Stephen King would say it doesn't matter. Read away. It doesn't matter about trying to fit into certain tropes. I mean, you definitely shouldn't try and do that. I don't think. Yeah.
Okay. This discussion is supposed to be focused around British fantasy, which brings up the question: do you think that there is a British fantasy? Is there something peculiarly British about a certain type of fantasy? Do you think? And if there is, what is it?
I'm not actually British, so I'm not sure why I'm in this book. I think it's the fact that I live in Britain. I've lived in Britain for a long time. I probably kind of get in by default, but yeah. And I've seen China Mieville recently did a thing when he called me one of the British writers, which I mean. Yeah, I don't really see myself as a British writer. I'm not a British fantasy writer. So do
you think of yourself as any particular type of fantasy writer, or do you just see yourself as a fantasy writer?
I just see myself as a writer. And I get really knocked. I mean, I can't really help it, but I hate being called a science fiction writer. Which is kind of you write one science fiction thing once, and you always get a science fiction writer.
Labelled for life.
And I just see myself as someone who happens to write science fiction and happens to write fantasy and various other things, but you get kind of pigeonholed. And the funny thing is, especially after I had this incredible year last year, obviously, and I got these 2 fantasy awards, and the reason and I'm really annoyed because every time I go and I hang out with a bunch of fantasy writers, I like to bring up the fact that I've got these awards. Which is really irritating. I mean, my wife is annoyed every time. But the reason I mention them every time is because it's just so absurd to me that I get labelled suddenly I get labelled as a fantasy writer. But if I had to describe it, I would say I come very much from being a science fiction fan. Very much kind of the old school science fiction fan who read every classic of science fiction there is, and I can bang on about obscure highlight stuff and so on and so forth. So it's just a very strange position to find yourself in. But whether there's British fantasy, I mean, Emma's story is science fiction, entirely science fiction, isn't it? In here.
In this one.
I mean, Jon, is your stuff more fantasy or science fiction?
I think it's when I was thinking about this, I thought this was maybe a bit more fantasy because it's about a sort of fantastical power that the character has, and there isn't really. Yeah, so I think that fits. I mean, I had the same thing. They do like to pigeonhole, and I was saying to my agent, I've got this other thing I'm writing, and it's not science fiction at all. I really want to show it to you, and you're just like, whoa. It's like, and I just get it's very difficult to cross over, and it's all about being a science fiction writer and everything, which I understand, and I don't mind actually. I mean, I'd love to people to know me as a science fiction writer. That'd be great. But yeah, in this, I would say it's more a fantasy side of things. Yeah.
But do you think there's anything peculiarly British about any of the stories that are in here, or in fantasy in general? Do you look at it? Because I have an opinion on that. But before I get there and throw mine out there. I'm curious to know what you think.
Well, most people would probably say that you can't, but there probably can't help but be some kind of, I don't know, like colonial guilt thrown in there somewhere. I mean, you even in your story in here, you mention people in this country, wondering why, talking about why people are, you talk about society here and the way they react to immigration and people and stuff. So that's actually a very British moment in the book, I think.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there is a specific British fantasy thing. I don't know.
No, I think there definitely is, or when I think of specifically British or specifically English fantasy, obviously, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Is it Norrell or Norrell? I've never, Mr. Norrell. That's, by the way, one of the things that scare me the most. It took Susanna Clarke 10 years to write this book, and she's been working on a sequel apparently. And it just scares me, the idea that Susanna Clarke, even as we speak, somewhere out there, I'd like to picture her in some, somewhere hidden, and she's quietly working away on this sequel that's going to take another 10 years or something, if it hasn't been 10 years already. And one day there's going to be this new Susanna Clarke, but it just really scares me that someone can sit there for so long and just patiently work on this enormous book. But I think Neil Gaiman called it, the best British fan, or English fantasy. I think he meant in the last 70 years, and I can see what he meant by that. It's the quintessentially English novel, English fantasy novel. When you think of, is it Lad in the Mist? Mm-hmm. Hope Merlis, which is kind of the other classical British fantasy from a long time ago.
Well, I was looking in my own library while I was thinking about this round table and trying to imagine what British fantasy is or what it might be. And what I kept coming back to was Robert Rankin, Jasper Fforde, Jonathan L. Howard, Malcolm Price, Tom Holt, and of course Terry Pratchett. And while they all have different styles and worlds and so on and so forth, the one thing they all have in common is comedy. They all write great comedy as an intrinsic part of their fantasy stories. And is it possible that British fantasy is really that flavour of irreverent, kind of inward-facing humour that features on class and status and hierarchy, and really that a lot of British writing has lent on over the years in terms of sitcoms and all kinds of things? It's in British people, I think, to think about that stuff.
Yeah. I forgot about Robert Rankin. I love Robert Rankin. I was so into that in my late teens. I absolutely loved the Brentford Triangle stuff. Absolutely. And I reread them. I absolutely love O'Malley and Pooley. But I think that comes down to how you define it again, because I've tried to write very science fiction stuff with a sense of humour, and people don't like it. I did eventually find something for one of the stories, but I've tried to write a sense of humour stuff with a science fiction, a real science fiction base, and found nothing for it. Whereas, I guess so maybe that's a dividing line. I don't know.
What do you think, Emma?
I think British or English literary fiction is definitely obsessed with class. I would say I don't know. I sort of think of the writers you mentioned, and I sort of think of some of the more slipstream fantasy writers that I might read, like Helen Oyeyemi or Nina Allen, or I'm trying to think of some other people, Jeanette Winterson, who I love, and I would say and I think they're more kind of magical realism writers to a certain extent. I think that's more of a thread. The writers that I find are really playful in terms of fantasy, I tend to find actually are more are outside of the UK. I love people like Calvino and Angelica Gorodischer and Rana Dasgupta, and they're all very playful writers, very kind of slipstream, and so I don't know if I'd say it was a particularly British thing. Probably the most, I thought perhaps the most British or English story in this collection was I think it's the Fish Pie one with Joseph de Lacy, and that really played on the sense of being British with this sort of character who reacts to an incoming apocalypse by concentrating on the fish pie. That's very British apocalypse. I don't know. Yeah.
But it's interesting that you picked that up because within that story, it's very much about social status, and it's about where he lives, and the great joy he took in jacking his job in when he realised that the world was going to end and he didn't need to do it anymore, and those kind of things. And then thinking about his mum's fish pie, which is you know, all that kind of stuff is very much about. There's a lot of humour in that, and there's a lot of joy in the story. But it is very much kind of class and status and stuff in that, and that's which brings me back to my point.
But I mean, I think again, well, I mean, Nina Allen is a good example of someone who I would think is a very British writer. You know, she's something in but I don't quite know why, but it's something in the way the stories she tells. It's just very British. But then I think, you know, if you have like in here, you know, I think Simon Bestwick, I would think is a very sort of British, you know, writer. And I think if you talk about fantasy, I mean, it's actually one of my blind spots is the British, especially the British ghost story, you know, which has a huge tradition here, and people are, you know, there are writers who just are obsessed with writing the classical British ghost story. I've never understood it on a personal level. I can read it and I can go, yeah, you know, there's like a ghost and you're being haunted by it and great, but I can see that people are really passionate about it, you know, and there's a real tradition of it, and people are still writing it today. It's almost as if people are just taking this one story and just trying to polish it until one day you get the perfect English ghost story, you know. But that's a very British thing. I don't think that tradition in that form exists outside, you know, the UK. So that's one form. And again, I think, you know, Jonathan Strange is very, very British. And it's not about the class so much. I think it's maybe it's the attitude to magic, because kind of if you come from American genre fiction, the approach to magic in fantasy is increasingly systemized. So it works like a science fiction novel. You kind of say these are the rules for the magic system, and the magic system works. Whereas, you know, Jonathan Strange and Lad in the Mist and other books like that kind of go, well, it's actually got a dream logic. It doesn't make any sense. You know, things kind of happen, and then they don't happen, and you know, and they don't have an internal logic to them. And I think that is one difference. I'm not sure that's necessarily particular to the English, but if you're comparing between English and American fantasy, I would say that's maybe one element of it. Maybe.
There's still that's always that kind of apprenticeship in British magic systems, isn't there? I mean, I would say from everything through something like, I mean, even Ben Aranovic's books, there's a sort of sense of learning and everything from that.
Yeah.
True. And I suppose in a way that kind of perhaps feeds into class a bit as well. I don't know.
Well, there are elements in Ben Aranovic's books. There are elements of class and status that come in, but largely because essentially it's they're police stories, but obviously there is going to be a hierarchy there, but also there's a very definite hierarchy status kind of thing within the various spirits, the river and so on and so forth that comes across. I don't want to labour on this too much, but it just seems to me that it's something that English people are a lot more obsessed with than anyone else.
I think Ben is almost like you could say he's not an English writer, he's a London writer, you know, in a way. Whereas Harry Potter, you think, is kind of your classical British. I mean, it really does that. The fact that it marries the boarding school genre, which doesn't exist anymore, really, but was so big in the 40s and 50s, and she marries that to this fantasy story. And it just works so well. I mean, it really was a brilliant combination. That's very British, isn't it?
Yeah. It's got that kind of nostalgia thing as well, I suppose, for that kind of bygone era.
Yeah, but it does hark back to, you know, Jennings and Just William and all those kind of things, as well as you know, being fantasy and all that kind of stuff. So.
And then Pratchett goes back to P.G. Wodehouse, you know, which is the big influence.
So clearly over the last few years, fantasy has had, you know, really big growing audiences, and there's significant take up with fantasy in other media, film, TV, games and so on and so forth. But despite the fact that it's hugely popular and it's growing and it's being used as source material in all kinds of other areas, it's still derided as kind of lightweight and not proper literature. and people say it's for kids, or it's for people that didn't grow up. And do you think, as a group, and I'll throw this to Jon first, that's kind of a hangover from traditional swords and sorcery type fantasy that most people know, or is there something more sinister at work in terms of mainstream publishing running and then the rest of the world feeling the same way?
Geez, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know who's. I'm sure you're right, but I mean, I don't know who's sneering at it really. I mean, I think it's sort of, it's definitely very much its own thing, and I mean, there's that sort of element of fantasy and magic, and I mean, these sorts of things I suppose have a quite childlike sense of wonder about them in terms of anything from John Carter of Mars to something like Harry Potter. There's a sort of childlike thing of wonder, and perhaps some people sort of tend to think like, well, I read adult books and there's something childlike about this which I don't need to bother with. That was then, and this is me now as an adult. Reading as an adult kind of a thing. I mean, I personally think that's completely redundant. I don't think that needs to be true at all, and that there's a huge amount there, because in the end it's about how good is the story. But I can't think of anything. I've never really seen it as anything beyond that, really. Just like people thinking that, as I say, there's a sort of childlike quality to it, which means that I shouldn't be reading it. I don't know.
I mean, I saw you shaking your head then.
No, I'm not sure I have an opinion for camera. No. Well, I mean, a lot of, at the end of the day, books are first and foremost entertainment, so, and you get these arguments online and so on all the time. It's how dare you call this book, less than perfect when it's the greatest book ever written, because I love it so much. It's got elves in it. And, what do we want from a book? This is kind of like the question. I mean, can we really point at something and say, it's a bit like my argument about steampunk. I was saying, steampunk as a genre is something I used to love back when, Powers and Blaylock and so on were writing it. And now it's obviously exploded 30 years later into this mass consumer identity. And I was going to say, well, can you, as someone who's written 3 steampunk novels at the end of the day, and actually doing a kind of steampunk comic series now, can you actually write a great steampunk novel that isn't just a steampunk novel, but is also a literary novel? And I'm not sure you can.
But I always think of steampunk and cyberpunk and those kind of things as they're an aesthetic more than anything else. If you want to write a steampunk thriller, then really you need to write a really good thriller, and the steampunk elements are the aesthetics that make up the world that the thriller is set in. But really what you're concentrating on is writing a thriller and making sure that it's a good thriller. You don't sit down and think, how can I make it the greatest steampunk novel or whatever, because how do you measure that? Do you measure that by the number of steam men you have in it, or is it the number of strange contraptions? How do you measure whether it's the greatest steampunk novel?
No, well, what I'm saying is, no, absolutely. Well, although I would disagree about it being an aesthetic. I mean, technically, it's about a specific era and a specific set. But I'm saying, what are we looking for in a great novel or a literary novel? Or, what makes it? Is it the way it treats its themes? I mean, is it in the way it's in what it's trying to say? And and you look at, say, I don't know, what's the big, George R. R. Martin thing?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. Right, I knew that. No, it's I read most of it when I was living in Laos, and I was absolutely desperate. There wasn't that much to do, in Laos, unless you go out and drink on the river or, watch very odd television channels. And I got hold of the Game of Thrones book. It was great because they were massive. They were like this big, so you have like 2 weeks worth of entertainment going in, and then I moved to London and I got too busy, so I didn't I got the last book and I was like, oh, I'm too busy to read this now, you know. It's like it was great when I needed it, you know. But I mean, and that's obviously the most successful fantasy book maybe of the moment, you know. But is it a great work of literature necessarily? And is that even something that we should be concerned with?
Well, you can be completely immersed in a book and absolutely loving it at the time, but it doesn't necessarily stay with you. I mean, I think books are written for different purposes. I mean, I read certain things, like you say, when you just want something for entertainment. You just want something that's fun and to, you know, take you away and to give you that escapism. And other books I'll read as a writer because I want to, you know, inform my own practice as a writer and try and be a better writer and learn from people. And I mean, ideally you get both, but that's rare. I think to get both of those things together. Yeah.
Maybe it's what you're saying about. I mean, what you were saying was about people being a bit sneery about the genre. Maybe it's that sort of obsessiveness that people have about their favourite books and things, because then people don't get that tweaky and twitchy-eyed and obsessive about great. I suppose they do. I suppose they do in a more sort of urbane way. Maybe, I don't know, but they, you know, the way people are about certain areas of fantasy can be very furious and full on. Can't
say a bad word.
Yeah.
What always strikes me though is you know, you talk about people saying being obsessed about Game of Thrones or whatever, as if it's like it's a standalone thing that only people who are obsessed with Game of Thrones are obsessive. But you know, I love to point out the fact that, you know, pigeon fanciers are like massive in comparison to fantasy fans, and they have conventions, they have gatherings. You know, I was blown away when I found out. I really, if I did think pigeons were kind of skanky, I would have probably gone undercover entered into the whole pigeon fancying more than the big pigeon fancying novel. You know, it's fascinating. And I tend to write convention things into a lot of my books because I'm so fascinated by that artificial environment of a convention. But a convention isn't just for science fiction and fantasy fans. It is for pigeon fanciers and for, you know, poker. Like, I'm a big poker fan in terms of watching poker on TV, not actually playing it. But poker has its own kind of fandom and superstars and gathering, and it's just across the board. It's
absolutely,
any kind of hobby, and you're going to get obsessive.
But poker fans don't dress up, do they?
Well, they dress like science fiction writers.
They may not dress as elf rangers or something, but they do dress up.
But not as other species.
Probably not. No.
Yeah.
Interesting. Do you think? Interesting. Another interesting point from this book, from my perspective, is that all of the, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can remember, all of the stories have a contemporary setting. There's nothing that's set in a kind of quasi-medieval Europe of any kind. There's nothing like that at all. They're all contemporary settings, which I found very interesting, because I was, you know, as I was reading through the stories, I was at some stage, I was saying, well, one of them's going to be about swords and sorcery and wizards and stuff. Somewhere in there there's going to be, and there wasn't, not one. And I'm guessing that that's partly a deliberate decision on the part of the editor-publisher, and partly maybe just because, you know, people are trying to write more these days. I was interested if any of you noticed that, and if any of you had made a conscious decision in writing your stories that it was going to be set in a contemporary setting, or did you not even consider that?
Well, the story I have in this was probably the most tailored approach, I suppose, I've taken to writing it, because I wanted to write something for Interzone, and it was the first thing I had published. So I very deliberately read a few of the Interzone backlogs and then tried to write something that I thought would appeal to that particular audience, which is, I don't normally work that way, but that was, you know, I wanted to have something in the science fiction magazine because we were trying to get a deal for my novel at the time, so that was quite a deliberate decision. But I don't know if I thought too much about being contemporary or not. It was just an idea I'd had for a while and it seemed to fit, so I worked it up for that particular submission.
Mine was reading about Kim Jong-il dying on the when I was on the bus. and thinking, and the same as you, I definitely write stuff specifically for Interzone, for their style, what they're after, really. And yeah, and so that was a decision to definitely like to sort of set it in and talk about, because there was a great article about a guy who'd been around when Kim Jong Il's dad, whose name I can't remember, Kim Il Sung, died. About how he'd gone through the mourning process and about how he'd felt he hadn't felt any grief, and he'd felt sort of terrible and like a bad person not to feel any grief and everything. So I just thought that was really interesting, and then came up with a little, quite more fantasy than sci-fi twist about where I could go with the story about that. Yeah, and I thought actually, to be honest, that's more like that could be good for Interzone as opposed to written specifically for them.
Yeah. I mean, I had no idea if they'd accept it or not.
Yeah, I mean, you never really do. Yeah, because I thought they'd never publish anything spacey, and then they did publish one of my spacey ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's I'm generally curious. What is an Interzone story? What's like?
Well, I don't really know. I didn't try to write in a particular style. I mean, I wrote in my style, but I wrote something that, I don't know, I guess I wrote something that was around a particular theme that I thought was science fiction and I hoped might fit there.
No, because you do hear people saying it a lot, that Interzone has a very specific kind of identity as a magazine. But I'm never quite sure
what it is.
What the typical Interzone story is.
I'm not sure either, to be honest. I definitely tried to write. So I did the same as you for the first one. I got published in there.
Yeah.
I read a few back episodes, story editions, and tried to write something off the back of that. That was just a sense of sort of mood, really, like they like sort of moody stuff. And I thought I didn't see anything spacey at all in anything they'd done for a few editions.
I think I read an Elliot de Baudard story, her sort of spacey one. So I did read a. How do you describe that?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it was quite interesting just reading that, because that was very much focused on character, and that's what I wanted to do. So I was like, okay, if something like that can be an Interzone story, then I guess my stuff might fit it as well.
So do you think? Do you think publishers play it safe with fantasy, play it too safe with fantasy when it comes to new writers, or is it just hard to find fantasy writers that are doing something new?
I think you kind of have to really. We're almost like we're having two different conversations, because we're talking about a short story anthology, which is a completely different thing to what most fantasy writers are doing, which is novels. Very big novels mostly. But there is such a disconnect between the world of novel writing and the world of short story writing. And I think there's this myth that writers start off by doing short stories and kind of work their way up the chain and then get around to publishing a novel, which is completely untrue. Most of the novelists I know just sat down and submitted a novel and never do short stories. If you're looking, and you're asking about sword and sorcery and so on, it's stuff, or the kind of more commercial fantasy, that's stuff that you get a lot in novels, obviously, but you hardly ever, there's no market for it in short fiction.
I have several anthologies of sword and sorcery fantasy at home, several anthologies, so it clearly is but the difference I'm guessing is most of the writers in those anthologies have written sword and sorcery novels, and their short stories are set in the same worlds, often fiction, the same characters, but in small vignettes.
Yeah, I mean, Jar Abercrombie's, obviously one of the most successful British fantasy writers today, but I think he's done at most a handful of short stories. I mean, I've seen a couple of his, but he's certainly not where he comes from, and he's not where his thing is. And I think short stories are interesting because that's where a lot of the really interesting stuff can be done, where you don't have to worry about, investing 6 months or a year, however long it takes to write a book, only to be rejected for being, completely uncommercial.
So do you think anthologies like this represent something of a playground for novelists or for writers?
Or you don't have to be a novelist necessarily. I mean, I'd probably be happier if I could just do short stories and
not completely reverse. I find it quite difficult.
Yeah, see,
I think it's a totally different art form. I think to be a good short story writer, you're not. You don't always get the two people who do good short stories don't necessarily write good novels, and vice versa. think it's really hard to write a good short story.
I think it's really hard to write a novel.
I think it's really hard to write a novel. I think it's really, really hard. I did exactly the thing. I did the writing short stories.
Yeah, I mean,
and then piling them up and then sending them off with the manuscript and all that sort of thing.
Okay.
I mean, you were saying about the publishers, but doesn't the agent have quite a lot of power as well these days? Like, I mean, because I was just struck because I didn't know anything about
if you
publishing.
get an agent.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah. But I mean, can you even send stuff direct to publishers?
Yeah,
now?
yeah.
You can.
Not all of them.
It's not the most pleasant thing in the world, but yeah.
Yeah.
Golan still do it.
Think
Todd,
Paul
Duke
does.
Karen doing it.
Oh, okay.
But it's
Okay.
but it's sitting there in a stack this high, and it waits for the work experience intern to come in and look through it. So.
But certainly, I think you've got a much better chance of being published with something experimental in the short form than you have
Yeah.
with, in a novel where the publisher has to invest a certain amount of money and hope to make the sales. So it's probably always going to be that way, that short fiction is more experimental.
But I mean, specifically, I think for different types of fantasy, I mean, going back to the Sword and Sorcery, because that's actually something I love, and I've done a series of stories featuring this character called Gorel of Galiris, which is the one that won the British Fantasy Award last year. And that's like nearly impossible to sell because they're too long, because you need space for an adventure story of that kind. So they're quite long, and no one really buys long stories because they don't have any money for it. So they buy 2,000 to 6,000 words is kind of your average length. So you end up writing these really long books with a lot of colour and magic, and I went for guns and sorcery because I can't figure out how you do swords. They kind of just go, So I figure a gun, where you are with a gun. But done all that, and basically I ended up selling them to Pierce Publishing to do as kind of limited edition books, which I'm very happy that I got to do that. But I would have been, in a way, I would have been happy if there was a magazine that I could have published them in, even as a long series. I mean, because it was so much fun to do, and I really wanted to just sit down and do something really fun and kind of go back to Seal Moore and the kind of classic 1930s fantasy, and there really isn't a market for it, I think.
But having established something of a name and won some awards, is self-publishing an option that's open to you now in a way that would make it easier for you to write on your own terms, in terms of having maybe doing this in short bursts or episodically or however you want to tell your stories, rather than write this great tome with all this amazing, wonderful, rich colour and stuff in it, and then have trouble selling it to someone?
Well, I'm going to self-publish a novella for my own amusement, because I really wanted to write a Nazi steampunk porn novella, which is like I wanted to I wanted to write a Nazi exploitation novel, because I'm obsessed with Nazi exploitation for my own various reasons. And I really wanted to write one, and then I figured, really, I'm not even going to look around for a publisher, And I got my artist, I'm working with on the comics, to do me a great cover for it. So I'll probably do that. But I mean, to be honest, I don't really believe in self-publishing. Just like I'm going into it, I'm going to do my own little minuscule small press to do my own little things, just for my own amusement, though. The reality is, I did one recently. I have a story that I really, really like. It's a novelette. It's an 11,000 word story, and I think it's one of the best things I've written. It's called The Projected Girl, and I sold it to Ellen Datlow for an anthology, a major New York anthology, Naked City, and it had all these very big name kind of commercial fantasy writers in, and I got paid very, very well for it. I got paid very, very well for it, and it was published in a mainstream paperback and went out and so on. And I thought, what would be really fun is to make it as an ebook, just for my own thing. And again, there's another artist I work with, and I got her to do this amazing cover for it that was just absolutely perfect. And I did the ebook, which I really enjoy doing. I don't know, have you tried doing ebooks before?
No.
It's very art and crafts sort of thing. I actually really enjoy that. It's a bit like doing fanzines or whatever, You feel like you're actually doing something. Like gluing bits together and photocopying, stapling, I missed that. So I did that, and I put it up on Amazon, and I linked it on Facebook and Twitter, and I sold 24 copies. at 99 cents. So I made $3 or something. So I'm not going to give up selling to a big anthology if I can. It's I don't know how you sell stuff, because I don't know. I think I'm lucky if anyone buys anything, really.
I agree about the 5,000 words thing. That drives me nuts. They do, like most magazines have like a 5,000 word short story limit, and everything I do comes out sort of 7 or 8. It always comes out 7 or 8, and I've tried to deliberately crop them down so they fit into 5,000 words, and then they don't make any sense. So that's very frustrating. Yeah.
Have you thought about the self-publishing route?
No, I really haven't. No. But I've just been. I mean, I'm quite an early stage, really. I'm just trying to. I was all about get some self-publishing, some good magazines, and try and get the book published, which is now going to be. So that's fantastic. I don't know about you.
I honestly can't see where I would find the time to promote my own stuff. I think that's the biggest thing for me, self-publishing. You do have 2 jobs. You have the job of writing the book, and then you have the job of promoting it to try and get anyone to read it. And I work almost a full-time job.
Isn't that part of the job of the writer anyway?
It is, but I suppose you'd have to do even more than I do already, and I already do a lot to try and, promote it. I'm here. So you do try and talk about your book, and you try and blog and do all of that kind of stuff, but I feel like some of that load has to be carried by a publisher. For me personally, I just don't feel where I fit in that time.
I think I've been fairly good at a certain amount of promotion, especially because I was editing the World SF anthologies, and I was really keen on promoting that. I don't really like promoting myself all that much.
If you're promoting someone else,
well, that's the thing. I thought I have an obligation to the writers to really promote this, and through doing that, I actually picked up a lot of, the avenues of promotion and so on. But then, what do you promote and how much do you promote? Especially if you have quite a lot coming out, you can't promote everything all the time. And also, I don't even know if in the final count it makes any difference whatsoever. If everyone can see you, if they never see you, at the end of the day, the book's going to have to sell itself somehow. But I think, in the UK, both I think Ian Sales and Tim Morn have been, I think, are quite impressive with what they've been doing with the self-publishing. Ian Sales won the BSFA award for short story this year. And I thought that was a really, really good. I was really annoyed actually because I like Ian, but I kind of thought, it's going to be rubbish. And then he sent me a review copy. I thought it was brilliant. This is really, really good.
Well, it's interesting. I know from my own experience on the Clark Award last couple of years that they've only just decided that they. Thankfully, as of next year, I won't be involved. But they're opening it up to self-published work, and the reason is because they were getting the criteria are published by a UK publisher in order to be entered by a UK publisher within a certain period in the year before, and there were previous Clark Award winners who had self-published work and who were legitimate science fiction eligible writers with eligible stories, but because the criteria didn't allow them to submit. They couldn't be submitted. So the criteria has been changed to allow that. I'm not quite sure how the criteria is going to bubble up, because I think if they open it up to anybody who's self-published anything can submit, then there's there's a plus side and a downside to that. The downside being that you'll have 5,000 books submitted of varying quality that you've got to wade through in order to find the winner. But it's interesting, I think, that when kind of major awards are saying, well, we're prepared to open up to self-publishing, that clearly self-publishing is making huge inroads, and it's got to the stage where a lot of credible, recognised writers with a back catalogue of traditionally published stuff are saying, well, actually, you know what, this is the way for me, because maybe they are fed up with trying to hawk stuff around and finding it difficult to sell. I find that interesting. I think the other thing is, and I'd be interested to talk to you guys about this. There's an enormous amount of talk about transmedia these days, and properties that can be exploited across films and TV and games and books and comics and then lunchboxes and everything else. And Clearly film companies have been doing this for years with what they do, but what they, I hate to refer to them as properties, but when you're writing novels, and now that you're doing comics and so on, do you think in those terms that, is this something that I can, if this takes off, we can do this with it, and we can do that with it, and maybe I can sell it over there, and I can do this, or is it not? Do you just, and I wonder if you see that kind of multi-platform exploitation of your work, is that the future of entertainment, or do you, as writers, do you just have to live with it, or are you back away from it? Do you hope and pray someone will come along and shower you with the money to say, can we make a film out of your book?
Yeah, I do. I've got the trailer for my book just totally storyboarded in my head. I've got it completely figured out. Yeah, I haven't thought about casting it, but yeah.
I did a book trailer for my book. That was something I just did myself though, because I think when I signed up with my publisher, they sent me a list of, are you going to do this, this, and this? And I thought, oh God, I don't know. Do I have to do a book trailer? Okay, I guess we can do a book trailer. And someone helped me make one, but
Cool.
I don't know if it was actually helpful or if anyone watched it really, or I don't know how useful those things are. I mean, I've seen a couple of good book trailers, but I don't know if they would make me want to read the book any more than I did already. Generally, I sort of, if I've heard enough about something to make me read it, and I don't think a book trailer is going to swing me either way.
But do you
but
think?
they're cool. I mean,
do you think in terms of Osiris? Do you think I can see the board game or the HBO TV series?
I think I write quite cinematically, so I'm the way I think about writing is often quite cinematic. So I can sort of, I can kind of see the translation into film as something that I wouldn't mind, but the whole action figures and all that sort of stuff coming out of it scares me a bit. I just kind of no.
So you have thoughts about
No, well,
I didn't even think of action figures.
Like, no.
I mean, there's an element of that. There's an element of that kind of, I guess. I would it ever happen to me? But if I was to sell a book as a film, sell the film rights to a book, my attitude would probably be, well, I've sold it. It's up to them what they do with it now. And I think you have to have that mentality so that when they go off and make the action figures and the lunchbox and that, it's nothing to do with
You
it.
have to let go of it once it's out in the world, essentially.
Yeah, but aren't there like thousands of books sitting on shelves that have had the rights bought and not?
Oh, very likely.
There's so many, aren't there?
Absolutely.
Because I'm sure someone bought. You've read Songs of Michael Marshall Smith, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure someone bought Spares, like Spielberg or someone bought Spares or something like that.
He
And that still hasn't been made, and then there's that other movie.
He ended up making The Island or something.
Which is kind of
Which is
Spares.
kind of like a rubbish version of Spares.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean,
obviously you're.
I have a terrible confession to make. To be honest, the only reason I wrote the new book, The Violent Century, which is coming out in October, the only reason I wrote it was to make the film, basically. I actually ended up writing a screenplay, which I thought was kind of cool, and I was talking to based on the conversation. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a film producer, and she was going on about never finding the right script for a British superhero film, and I was like, well, British because superheroes are really crap, and the only way a British superhero would work would be to do it like this, and I was thinking, that's not too bad. So I kind of ended up, I had 2 months, I was stuck in South Africa or something, and I ended up writing the first draft of the screenplay and really liked it. And she read it and she really liked it. She was like, but it's like a massive budget, you're talking about like a proper Hollywood film, and it's going to be really hard. Obviously, we don't have the budget to buy it. So maybe you should write a novel first, and then you can sell the property based on the book. I was like, that's not a bad idea either, So I kind of, so it's a completely accidental book.
So you reverse engineered a film into a book?
Yeah, so it got even worse. So I ended up writing this book, but I decided I'll do it really literary and kind of, so I have all this literary stuff going on in there. And my agent was like, why can't you write like a normal book? Why are you doing all this like stuff? And I stopped working on it for 3 months because I was so stressed by his comments, and I tried to write like a normal book and I couldn't. And I kept writing in the way, it's very weird sort of, it doesn't have like, quote marks for speech and that sort of stuff. And I've been reading and I've been revising it and editing it and rereading, and I've been reading the page proofs now, and I just thought, I hate this book so much. It's like, I don't understand why I went for this kind of wanky literary stuff. I mean, everything about this book is terrible. It's like, why didn't I listen to my agent? It's like, I really hate this book at this point. I've read it far too many times now to even see any value in it. But what happened then, we were talking to Titan about doing a comic series. And this is what I wanted to do as a comic, you know. So I was planning to adapt it again into this 6-part comic series. And I was like, this is going to be the next Watchmen. It's absolutely brilliant. Like, and what I thought is, obviously no one's going to buy this book for ages. So we can sell the graphic novel in the meantime. And Paul actually did the first 3 pages of the script, which looked amazing. Yeah. And instead we ended up selling the book in like 2 weeks. And Titan said, you know, we can't, obviously we want an original property, we don't want an adaptation of a novel. So I was like, oh, well, I've got this other thing on the hard drive, you know, this steampunk thing. They're like, yeah, this is brilliant, let's do that. So yeah, the only reason this book exists is that hopefully, you know, we'll get the big budget multi-million-dollar film made, which is a ridiculous way of doing things. But it worked out really well for me. I ended up getting a book I never intended to write and getting a nice book deal, and very odd.
Did you think that's something that you'll do again? Is you'll sit there and think, well, what are the 10 different ways I can exploit this thing?
Yeah. My wife makes fun of me because I can't even let go of short stories. I have to resell them, even if I resell them for $5. I got an extra $5 out of this story, and she's like, you can't let go, can you? You're gonna squeeze them dry. It's like, just do something new for crying out loud, you know. I'm like, no, I can't. I have to just keep pushing them out there.
But it's interesting that you write in different formats like that. That you can, you know, you work in either comic form or script form or book form. I mean, I think I'm very much a book writer. I wrote a couple of plays once, but I think I'm much more of a novelist than.
I was going to ask actually, so you never wrote like a screenplay?
No, I've never tried it.
You never wrote lots of different stuff?
I've never tried it.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting.
Because I started writing screenplays, wanting to write, you know, movies and all that sort of thing. I really wanted to do a movie adaptation of this fantastic Sergio Aragonés comic called Gru, which is very fantasy, and actually that has a really good sense of humour, and I can't figure out whether that's Sergio Aragonés, which I think it probably is, or whether it's the translation, I don't know. But I always wanted to do a movie of that. I'd love to do a movie of that, and I wrote scripts for that. And
I can recommend a really good book, Writing the Science Fiction Stuff, by Robert Grant. Available now through Michael Weason Publishing.
Excellent.
Yeah. Might see if I can go review copy.
I'm sure a trade can be had.
Yeah.
Interesting. Another thing I want to come back with this anthology is all of the stories have very light touch with the fantasy. I think, you know, they're kind of people in their ordinary everyday lives, and then something kind of happens, and then and it's a very light touch. There's no it's not deep and rich with all kinds of fantasy elements all the way through. What I'm kind of looking at is coming back to this idea of British fantasy, I guess, and the fact that these are all kind of contemporary stories. I'm trying to talk more around that kind of idea, and I think because people tend to write, they tend to write, explore the world around them, and they tend to think about the issues that kind of matter to them, and trying to find a way to explore that in the writing. Do you think that kind of, to a certain extent, is raining against the mundanity of everyday life? Do you think that's a big part and parcel of kind of writing fantasy stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Go on, pick it.
Well, I mean, I kind of love that writing that is in the everyday world and then manages to find some kind of surreal or magical element about it. That's just personal preference. I mean, I love, Haruki Murakami's work. I think does that very well, where you've got someone in quite an ordinary job and just doing ordinary things like cooking, mostly in Murakami, listening to jazz, and then something shifts and you kind of see the world in a different way, and I think that's becoming harder to do the more we are in a kind of digital age. I think that's something that's going to be quite interesting to see how writers do that and manage to find still that kind of magical, surreal element in that kind of environment. I'm not sure if that's really answering your question, but Yeah, no, it was interesting. I think a lot of these stories could probably be classed as more slipstream writing, perhaps, and that's. I think there's a much more of an overlap now between what you might call mainstream work and genre work, and you have a lot of mainstream writers dipping into fantasy or science fiction and using elements of that in their work. I mean, someone like David Mitchell is probably a really good example of that. But I think that's happening more and more now.
Do you think that current fantasy writers are doing, because it sounds like what you're saying is current fantasy writers are doing something quite new, they're not really just kind of retelling the same old myths and legends and fairy tales and stuff that we're used to. Do you think that's true? Go on.
I'm feeling increasingly like badly read
Yeah.
listening to these two, because I feel really badly read. I honestly do. I don't know. I mean, I think, like you say, I think it's a slightly different. It feels like a different. It feels slightly uncomfortable to call quite a lot of it what's in there fantasy in some ways.
Don't say that. I'm supposed to sell the book.
Yeah.
Fantasy.
But it's awesome, obviously.
But again, it's in different interpretations.
Yeah, it's different interpretations. I mean, I wouldn't. Yeah.
Yeah, my story I would have said was science fiction, but that's.
I would have said your story was whereas I can see mine as having like a more fantastical element. But I was thinking around the bus this morning, thinking, I wonder if it is or if it isn't.
Do a lot of your best thinking on the bus.
I do loads of my best thinking on the bus. I have brilliant stuff on the bus.
Can't beat the train.
Train is good as well.
Actually,
but I fall asleep on the train.
DLR is probably the best.
Yeah.
Because of the kind of the post-apocalyptic view you get of East London.
Yeah, that's good.
Fantastic.
I mean, I quite like speculative fiction as an overall label.